Hello and welcome to episode 72 and 73, Intelligence Bureau Research and Analysis Wing and the Making of Indian Foreign Policy. Today's guest, we had him previously on the podcast, primarily to discuss the evolution and the strategies of the Indian intelligence. So, without any delay, I would like to welcome you again, Dr. Dheeraj Parmeshachaya. Hi, Dheeraj. Welcome to the podcast again.
Thank you, Omkar. Thank you for having me once again.
Yes, absolutely. I think the previous episode of yours received quite a lot of response, not only from India, but quite a lot of people from my European network as well. And I think, yeah, I hope the same thing happens with this episode and the future episodes as well. I'm pretty sure it will happen because the kind of insights that you bring into the discussion are very interesting. And I hope, basically that's how we can kick off this discussion as well. So yeah, without any delay, directly jumping into the topic itself. Uh, we are talking about the India's internal intelligence agency, external intelligence agency, that is Intelligence Bureau and RAW. So how did they came into existence, both these agencies, and what are the key reasons behind their formation?
First of all, thank you, Omkar. Thank you, firstly, for having me, and also those letting me know that you've had such kind responses from your listeners.
Yes.
Having said that, I think that we briefly touched upon the history of these agencies in our previous podcast, but I think that it's good to not just repeat, but go into further detail and explore the
Yes.
evolutionary aspect or the evolutionary the
Yes.
history of Indian intelligence agencies because it's important. One, it's interesting and it's also quite complex. So when we look at the evolutionary path of both the IB and the R&AW. First, let's talk about the IB because the IB is much older than the R&AW. So the IB was actually formed in 1887. I wouldn't say formed, but in the year 1987, the Intelligence Bureau celebrated its centenary, and that's when the agency traced its origins to the year 1887, when an organization called the Central Special Branch was created. I mean, the year 1887 itself is quite unique, and anybody who's well versed with the colonial past of India, they would know that in 1885, the Indian National Congress came into being, and just 2 years later, the Central Special Branch was created. So, quite logically, it was created because the British wanted to monitor the political, religious, and social movements in India. Because up until then, the only concern for the colonial intelligence agencies, which was then called the Thuggy and Dakaiti Department, was, as the name suggests, organized crime of the Thuggy sorts or the Dakaiti incidents that are happening across the length and breadth of the country. But come 1887, there was a realization amongst the colonial British that they now needed to monitor these political, religious, and social movements in India because they seemed to somehow threaten the legitimacy of the colonial state at that point in time. So the Central Special Branch was created, which then, during the First World War, was rechristened as the Intelligence Bureau. So that is the colonial past of the present day Intelligence Bureau. Once we gained independence in 1947, or rather in 1946 itself, when there was this interim government formed, you had a man named Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel who became the interior minister and later the home minister. So he was an enthusiast of this profession. He knew the value of intelligence for policy making, for decision making. So he realized that India needed an intelligence agency, but it was not clear what kind of an intelligence agency India required at that point in time. Because somewhere we had leaders who were idealists, who had just come out of the freedom struggle. So they did not. So they wanted an organization that would serve a democracy more than serve a state, because they had seen what would happen if an intelligence agency served a colonial state. So they now wanted an intelligence agency that served a democracy, but how this would happen, I mean, what kind of an agency they would create, there was no real clarity over this. So what Patel did around at that point in time was that he picked up a man by name Rao Bahadur Sanjeevi. He had some intelligence background with the Madras police, and he made him the director of the intelligence bureau. But Sanjeevi had, let's say, very unrealistic ideas about what he wanted to do with Indian intelligence. So when he went around meeting intelligence chiefs across the world, mostly from the Western countries, and trying to get their help in terms of creating an intelligence agency for India,
Yeah.
there was a realization that he wanted to create something humongous. He wanted, which would have been somewhat similar to the KGB in Russia, in Soviet Russia, or the Gestapo in Germany, and so on. So what he wanted was a mammoth agency which would sort of monitor every activity that happened in India. Right. So
Yeah.
this was something that was unacceptable, especially to the military, the Indian military, right? So there was something known as the Chief of Staff Committee. And within the Chief of Staff Committee, there's an organization called the Joint Intelligence Committee. Unfortunately, most people don't talk about this organization. But if you look at the British intelligence system, the Joint Intelligence Committee is one of the most important intelligence agencies of Britain. So they
Yeah.
had left one JIC in India as well, which is situated within the Chief of Staff Committee. So Sanjeevi wanted all of that to be subsumed under the Intelligence Bureau, but the military put up a resistance, and so the JIC continued to be with the Chief of Staff Committee until Indira Gandhi came to power, and then it was moved to the Prime Minister's office, and subsequently in 2018 it was dissolved. So let's not talk about JSC for now, but the IB at that point in time, Sanjeevi wanted it to be this kind of a mammoth, humongous organization, but it did not happen during his tenure. But ironically, what happened in 1950 was that when the People's Republic of China sort of occupied Tibet, and Tibet ceased to exist because up until then, India shared its border with Tibet, not China. But now there was increasingly the risk of China taking over Tibet and China being India's neighbor. So at that point in time, the Intelligence Bureau wrote a letter which was handed over to the Home Minister Sardar Patel, who then forwarded it to Prime Minister Nehru. It was a comprehensive assessment of what are the challenges India is likely to face from China, and so how India now needs to prepare for this upcoming challenge. So when this letter was submitted, that was when a body was a committee was organized, and this committee was known as Himmat Singh Ji Committee, or alternatively, it was also called the North and Northeast Border Committee. So it was this
Okay.
particular committee which studied the problem of border management in India, which studied the problem of, they sort of forecasted what kind of challenges India would face with China and so on. And then they came to the conclusion that the IB now has to be made responsible for strategic military intelligence. Right. So what Sanjeevi had wanted to do by his own conviction, and India, the political leaders of the day and the military refused to hand it over to him, was made possible in 1950 because of what China did with Tibet.
Yeah.
So since 1951 onwards, IB became responsible for all kind of intelligence, foreign intelligence, for strategic military intelligence, counterintelligence. So all of these came under the purview of the Intelligence Bureau, and it remained so until about 1968. So what happened in the interim, as far as India's foreign policy was concerned, is that one, yes, there was always this conflict with Pakistan over Kashmir, but more importantly, in 1962, we went to war with China, or rather, China invaded India. So that
Yes.
was one of the events that gave birth to the realization that somewhere something is wrong in terms of gathering foreign intelligence, developing or producing foreign intelligence. But still, things did not change. There was one minor change, and that change was that we created three sub-organizations within something known as the Directorate General of Security. I'll come to that later, but these three sub-organizations were called the Special Frontier Force, Special Service Bureau, and the Aviation Research Center. So this DGS was placed within the Intelligence Bureau, and they continued to exist up until 1968. In between, in 1965, India fought another war, but this time with Pakistan. And most of the post-event analysis have shown that the IB had given sufficient intelligence about Pakistan's intentions, but somehow we still ended up being surprised. So a series of these events gave birth to the realization that now India needs a dedicated foreign intelligence agency, which will not be bothered by the internal dimensions, internal security threats, and so on. So that is how
Yeah.
the R&AW came into existence in September 1968. On 21st September 1968, the Research and Analysis Wing was formed. But there is one alternative theory. I mean, it is speculative, but it is also believable because the R&AW was created by Indira Gandhi, and
Yes.
unlike Nehru, Indira Gandhi has left very little in writing. So we don't really know her thoughts. We don't really know how she thought, or what her intentions were, and so on. So most of what she's done has been open to speculations. But one thing is clear, that we know that she was someone who was hungry for power, and she really had very strong political opponents, because most of her political opponents were freedom fighters, and they commanded a lot of respect with the public and so on, right?
Yeah.
So there is this theory that when Indira Gandhi became the prime minister, the home ministry was really strong, and then home minister was YB Chavan, who was also a very strong leader from Maharashtra. So she did not like the fact that the IB was placed within the Home Ministry, and the IB held so much of power, right? So she won't. So the speculation is that this could have been one of the reasons why she bifurcated the IB and created the R&AW, and also she subsumed the JIC within the Prime Minister's office. So the R&AW was placed within the Prime Minister's office. So was the JIC, and the IB was left to the Home Ministry, because now the IB was only going to look after internal intelligence.
Yeah.
So that's how these organizations were formed. But if you want me to speak a little bit more about the roles and responsibilities, then I'll have to go forward and say what happened after the creation.
Yeah, I think I was going to come to that point. I mean, like you have given the historical perspective, but briefly, if you can touch upon the part like what are the roles and responsibilities in the current geopolitical scenario, because the current age that we live in, it's quite different than what it was in the past. So I believe, like, things might have changed. If they haven't changed, there might be some kind of dynamics which would have basically brought a difference in the way these agencies operate. So can you briefly touch upon the part of the roles and the responsibilities in the current times, basically, of these organizations?
Right. I think, Omkar, one of the fundamental flaws that I see in the way this question has been shaped is that when we say the current geopolitical scenario or anything of that sort, right? Historically, if you
Yeah.
observe it, or if you go on an observation, one of the primary things that we notice is that India finds
Yeah.
itself in a geographic space where most of the tectonic shifts in global geopolitics have happened in this region, right? So you look at the Cold War, you look at the Sino-US rapprochement, you look at most of the things that have happened, the global war on terror. It all happens in this region, right? So when we say the current world order, or when we say the current geopolitical developments and so on, right? India is no stranger to this. So when we say that there has been a changing global order or the current geopolitics, we are generally looking at it from a Western perspective. But when you look at it from an Indian perspective, there's always been a continuity. So, what roles and responsibilities the IB and the R&AW have today is not entirely new, is not something significantly changing from the past. It has been consistently the same, because we have been facing the threat of cross-border terrorism for a very long time.
Yeah.
We've been facing the threat of having nuclear powered hostile neighbors for decades on, right? So all of these have been in existence. It is just the scale that has changed. So let me say that the 1970s or 80s was a starting point when cross-border terrorism started in, let's say, in Punjab and Kashmir and places around the borders of India and Pakistan. So from then on, the IB started to have some bit of foreign intelligence role, in the sense that from 1968, after the R&AW was created, the IB was rid of any foreign intelligence role. But the moment terrorism became a reality, cross-border terrorism became a reality, the IB was given some leeway, let's say about 10 miles or 20 miles into across the borders, to gather as much intelligence as they can for the purposes of counterterrorism. Now that is going to continue even today, because our neighbors haven't changed their attitudes. As far as the R&AW is concerned, the R&AW also started to spread its capabilities across the world to monitor threats that were um, going to, in a sense, those were threats that were going to target India internally, let's say the Khalistan movement, or also to monitor the orbit or the order of battle of the Chinese and the Pakistani forces. So it
Yes.
is extremely difficult for India to gather any China or Pakistan related intelligence from Pakistan and from China, because these two states are generally what we call as counterintelligence states, and gathering any intelligence from there has become extremely difficult. especially when you look
Yeah.
at the from the 1990s onwards, the kind of harassment that Indian intelligence operatives and Indian diplomats too, not only Indian intelligence operatives and Indian diplomats, but also their spouses and the family members, the kind of harassment they've undergone in Pakistan is something that is noteworthy, but most people don't talk about. So, given that kind of an environment, it is very difficult for India to develop any intelligence from these countries. So, the R&AW tries to gather intelligence or produce intelligence on the Pakistani order of battle or the Chinese order of battle, the military developments and so on, from other countries, from where they procure or where they've got a diaspora, be it in the United States, in Europe, in Africa, in some Australia, and so in many other parts, and
Yeah.
also where there is an Indian diaspora, right? I mean that gives you a good source of information. Let's say, for example, when you look at East Africa, most of these East African countries have Indian population that migrated during the colonial times, and
Yes.
they've also reached to position of political authority in some fashion, and they
Yeah.
become natural allies for India. And also because India's own policy of non-alignment and so on has somehow sat well with these African countries, because they are also post-colonial states, and they don't want to be caught up in this. They did not want to be caught up in this whole Cold War business in during the Cold War period, and even now they are trying to sort of balance and between the multiple poles that are emerging across the world, right? So
Yes.
that makes them a natural ally to India, and so you see India's or the R&AW's capability spreading to all these countries. So, but the core question of what roles they have, now this is something that is a bit dicey, because India does not believe in putting down anything on paper. I think after the Kargil War in 1999, there was a group of ministers, report that came up in 2001, and on that basis, it was said that the IB now is going to be India's premier counterintelligence agency. Now that was always known, but I think they did put it down on paper and give it a charter. But as far as the R&AW is concerned, I am told that there have been some efforts to give it a charter of duties, but not really. So it is when somebody asks me the question, what role or responsibilities do these agencies have? It is just left to one's common sense. So any threat that India faces from external sources becomes the R&AW's responsibility, and any threat from internal sources becomes the IB's responsibility. And what they are is something that everybody knows. So as far as foreign intelligence is concerned, it is primarily China and Pakistan. And
Yes.
as I was explaining, even though the R&AW has spread its capabilities across the world, the targets are these two countries.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you mentioned quite a lot, I think, into the facts that how Indian government and other national security agencies coordinate well with the IB and R&AW as well.
hmm.
And just to then step ahead a little bit, I would say, in what ways do the intelligence inputs from IB and R&AW influence the foreign Indian foreign policy decisions? Because you just mentioned about the way I think the intelligence gathering happens, or the way intelligence operatives or the diplomats or the bureaucrats, their families are being harassed in countries like Pakistan.
Hmm.
So, from that perspective, can you mention like how the inputs from these agencies basically influence the foreign policy decisions, especially in this day and age where we live in of globalization? I think the foreign policy is very important at the moment.
Absolutely. I do agree with you. Look, theoretically speaking, there is something known as an intelligence cycle. Now, most intelligence scholars will be unhappy to hear about this particular cycle, because it never works like that. So it starts with your policymakers giving you a certain task. They would say that we need to make this policy, so we need some information about X target, and then that goes to the intelligence agencies, and then they task their collectors and so on, and then whatever information is gathered is put through a process of analysis, and then they produce an intelligence report, which is then handed over to the decision makers, and the decision makers then make the decision on the basis of whatever reports they've got from the intelligence agencies. Now, this is how theoretically it is structured, but nowhere in the world does it actually work this way. uh, the reason why I mentioned this is, in India, there is no space for this intelligence cycle whatsoever, simply because foreign policy making in India is purely arbitrary. So
Okay.
most there is a Minister for External Affairs, there is a Ministry of External Affairs, but generally speaking, foreign policy in India has been the protectorate of the Prime Minister. So Jawaharlal Nehru, he himself was both the MEA as well as the PM. And during Indira Gandhi's time as well, during Rajiv Gandhi's time, you pick any Prime Minister's name, foreign policy has been conducted by the Prime Minister of the day.
Okay.
And the next question is, what incentives do they have? What drives the formulation of foreign policies? There are numerous incentives for them, right? If I can just take the example of the 1999 bus diplomacy before the Kargil war happened, right? You had Vajpayee, visit Pakistan by bus, and people felt that now these two countries are going to be friends and so on and so forth and all that. Technically speaking, if you went according to the intelligence cycle, right, what should have happened was that the Prime Minister or the Minister of External Affairs should have tasked the intelligence agencies, that is the R&AW, to find out what Pakistan's intentions are they going to be friendly, will our
Yes.
policy work, and so on and so forth, right? So that's how the theoretically it was supposed to work, but that did not happen. The R&AW was not even, they were not contacted, they were not. No advice from them was sought at that point in time. It was just an arbitrary decision taken by the prime minister of the day, and naturally there were political calculations, there were probably economic calculations, so there were a lot of ideas that went in which had nothing to do with intelligence. So when you look at
Okay.
foreign intelligence in India, it is mostly determined by one factor, that is who leads this agency. So historically, when you look at India, right, from 1947 up until now, you'll find that we've had a couple of very strong leaders, be it R.N. Kao, who was
Yes.
the founder of R&AW. More importantly, most people don't talk about this person, but I think that he has influenced Indian intelligence more than anybody else. His name is Bholanath Malik, the second director of IB and the longest serving intelligence chief in India. So he was extremely close to Nehru. So he too had some bit of influence. And now, though not chief of intelligence, but as the national security advisor, we know that Mr. Dole is quite influential in terms of guiding Modi towards national security policies and foreign policies and so on, right? So Indian intelligence system has always been reliant on these personalities. So inputs keep going, reports keep flowing to the concerned authorities. But if you ask me about foreign policy making, it is always on the basis of personalities, and it is always on the basis of calculations independent of whatever foreign intelligence inputs they might have got. It is unfortunate,
Interesting.
but that is how it is in India.
Interesting. Yeah, I was not aware about this fact, the way you mentioned, like it's mainly the prime minister who, takes the charge. Just stepping ahead into the conversation, I would say, because, we have discussed about this foreign policy aspect and everything, little bit, going ahead into the international circle, I would say. Can you
Mhm.
also provide insight into how foreign agencies like CIA, British SS, USF, etc., were also involved in helping India build several other agencies after IB and R&AW?
Right. Okay. This is an interesting question. So let me put it this way. If you look at the British intelligence, right, and the relationship that India shares with British intelligence, you can look at it in terms of an Indian familial dispute over property or something like that, right? So the moment colonialism ended, we ended the relationship with them, but our agencies were all inherited from them. That is, the IB was inherited from the was actually the colonial IB. Same goes with Pakistan. Same goes with Bangladesh. Same goes with many of the post-colonial states, right? So we could not sever our ties completely with the British. We had to have some degree of let's say dependence, or dependence would be a strong word, but it was also a fact that we had to depend on them extensively for foreign intelligence because we had no experience in that. But the key
Yeah.
factor that actually influenced our relationship with these Western intelligence agencies was our overt foreign policy. Now, what happened was the moment India and Pakistan were created, we took the path of non-alignment, which was something that the West did not understand, and that's the best case explanation. But the worst case explanation is that they saw that India was hostile to them, whereas Pakistan, on the other hand, was clearly in their club. They had signed the CETO and CENTO and other treaties, which made them an ally of the Western countries.
Yes.
So in the intelligence domain, the Indian Intelligence Bureau was very much close to the British intelligence. In fact, during the 50s, many of our intelligence managers, intelligence officers were trained either in Singapore or in London for
Okay.
archiving. For many of the foreign intelligence skills and so on, we were trained in London or in Singapore. But
Okay.
one of the perils of foreign intelligence cooperation is that no intelligence agency in the world will share with you the state of art of anything that they have. It'll always be one step below because they want to have that advantage because intelligence itself is in a competitive space, right?
Yes.
So every country wants to have an edge over you, and in that competitive space, data is wealth. Access to data is wealth. Technologies that can give you data is wealth. So no intelligence agency will actually share with you exactly what you want. It will always be at least one generation behind, right? So
Yeah.
this happened during the 1950s. So we did benefits from some bit of cooperation with the British and also Americans, but it happened um, through interpersonal relationship between the officers. It was not institution to institution or it was not country to country.
Okay.
Then in 1960s, the moment the India-China war happened, that is when the real change came about. So overtly, we didn't say that we are doing away with the non-aligned policy. We are still part of the non-aligned movement and so on. But somewhere there was a realization that there's little India can do independently by itself. It does not have the kind of capabilities. So at least in the intelligence domain, there was a realization that now we need to develop closer relationship with these Western countries. So that was the period. So if you remember, when you asked me the first question about the evolutionary history of Indian
Yes.
intelligence, I mentioned about something known as the DGS, Directorate General of Security.
Yes.
So, and within the DGS, there were three organizations that were created, and the first one is called the Special Frontier Force. The Special Frontier Force actually comprises of Tibetans,
Okay.
but today they operate under the R&AW administratively, but they also work with the Indian Army. So, but this organization was created with the help of the American CIA because the CIA at that point in time, during the early 60s and so on, they were working with the Tibetans, trying to organize like a rebellion within Tibet, and trying to. So all these kind of court operations do happen, and India stood to benefit from it. So both the CIA and the then IB started to work together, and they raised this particular organization. And at the same time, the then director of Intelligence Bureau, Bolanath Malik, who I was talking about, right? So he was a strong votary. He was an advocate of civil defense. So he realized that after the 1962 war, he realized that we cannot rely on the army alone to defend against China, and we cannot rely on the IB alone to generate intelligence. We need the public to bring us whatever information they can. We need the border population to feel Indian. They need to be developed as intelligence assets. So what
Okay.
he did was he created this organization called Special Service Bureau. The Special Service Bureau is, I mean, we can talk about it in another podcast. We can go into greater detail, but the Special
Yes.
Service Bureau was meant to be a border agency, uh, manned mostly by the border population, not by uniformed people, not by trained, intelligence officers and so on. And they would be the first line of defense. Now, who helped us in creating in raising this organization? It was the British SAS, the Special Air Service.
Okay.
So the British SAS helped the IB raise this particular organization, and this organization served India really, really well up until 2001. After that, it was dissolved again. Let's not go into those details, but it served India quite well. I mean, their contribution to India's national security is quite phenomenal, and unfortunately, it's not been recorded in most places. So they served till 2001, and then there was another organization that was created, which is known as the Aviation Research Center. Now, this was created with the help of the CIA and the U.S. Air Force, and manned jointly here by the Indian IB as well as in collaboration with the Indian Air Force. Now, what this organization does is it exists to this day. It is with the R&AW. They maintain a fleet of aircrafts, which are, whose purpose is to gather imagery intelligence, uh, and they are known to fly in ways that can evade radar detection and so on. So all these three organizations were created with the help of the British and Americans. But this was a very brief honeymoon period, between 1962 and 1966. And after that, we realized that they can't be complete reliance on just these two countries. So that's when we started to diversify our dependencies on various other foreign Western countries, most importantly Israel and France. So to this day, when we talk about India's foreign intelligence capabilities, much of our capabilities, if they come from abroad, they come from these two countries, from France and Israel. But again,
Okay.
after 2001, once the global war on terror, was launched by the United States, again, US realized that India has this vast experience of fighting terrorism, and they're a natural ally when as far as this question comes. And so but they realized that over the years, India has shown that they need to be treated differently. Because Indian intelligence also over the years realized that being part of these alliances are not really helping us. And to give you a quick example of how this worked was in 1966 itself, right? So I think I mentioned this in a previous podcast, but it's worth
Yeah.
repeating here. Where we had established a signals intelligence, we had installed a signals intelligence equipment in the Indian Northeast, and this was given to us by the Americans, and they had handled it, and they had told Indians that they will share the data with India. This is meant to monitor the order of battle of the Chinese across the border, right? Now, the Americans used the
Yes.
same equipment to monitor Indian order of battle in the northeastern region, and they shared it with Pakistan, and the Pakistanis then conveniently forwarded it to the Chinese. So this one equipment, you see, it was serving everybody or serving nobody, depending on how you look at it. So, based on the basis of all these kind of experiences, right? India realized that we cannot completely get into these, international intelligence alliances and so on, because we stand to lose more than we stand to gain. So the Americans also somehow realized that okay, now India has this kind of historical baggage, and they need to be treated differently. So they came up with something known as single intelligence specific, SIGINT specific. So this is meant to share signals intelligence with India only in this particular region, where the Indo-Pacific region,
Yeah.
where there's free exchange of information and so on. This it came somewhere close to resembling the Five Eyes, but not entirely, because the Five Eyes is somehow it's a kind of racist club where only these white countries sit together. But
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
there is any development that actually came somewhat close to the Five Eyes arrangement, it is this particular arrangement.
Yeah.
So that
Interesting.
happened during the global war on terror, and today again, because if we had to look at an arrangement, an intelligence cooperation arrangement that would come close to the Five Eyes arrangement between, say, India and the United States, simply because we call these two countries as natural partners and so on, then this SIGINT specific is probably the closest that we have. Beyond that, we have nothing to say that there is such close intelligence cooperation between India and these Western countries that can qualify to be an equivalent of the Five Eyes arrangement. So we don't have anything of that sort. And today, with the coming of the Chinese threat, there is some form of alignment between how India and the United States perceive China. They are subject to change. They're subject to transformation on the basis of newly developing realities. But at least as far as today is concerned, I can say that both India, the United States, UK, and all these countries, they have a certain perception of China which is aligned. So we are seeing intelligence cooperation develop in this area, but the exact details are not known to us. These are only known to the professionals in the field. But to give you an overview of whatever I have been saying all this while, India's intelligence cooperation with the Western countries is mostly determined by the Chinese threat, even in the
Okay.
past and today as well.
Okay.
The colonial past has given us some leeway to have some bit of cooperation, but that has developed only on the basis of interpersonal relationship between intelligence officers in those countries and intelligence officers in our country. But as far as institution to institution or strategic cooperation is concerned, India and the West has required the China factor. And as long as the China factor is there, there is room for cooperation. And terrorism has briefly allowed cooperation, but now I don't think that the US is as serious. Oh,
Yeah.
US is not as serious about terrorism as it was a decade ago.
Yeah.
So now the landscape of global counterterrorism is changing. So I don't know to what extent India and the West are cooperating on that front. But I do assume that there is some bit of cooperation happening between India and these Western countries, especially if you look at the threat of Khalistani terrorism today in India. We
Yes.
know that the threat is not so much a threat in India, but it is a threat that is emanating from foreign countries. And again, I can't speak about US and Canada to what extent they're cooperating with India, but at least as far as Britain is concerned, there have been the cooperation between Indian intelligence and the British intelligence is quite serious. So that is the current status of cooperation between India and these Western countries. There are dependencies for technologies. For instance, you have the geospatial intelligence, which the United States is sharing with India. That again concerns China. So as far as China is concerned, there is sufficient room for cooperation between Indian intelligence and the Western intelligence. But beyond China, I don't think that there is much appetite in the West to support India. But having said all this, the fundamental point is that India cannot get the latest technologies or the latest intelligence tradecraft techniques from the West. Those are some things that India will have to develop indigenously, and I think that we are on that track.
Interesting.